Welcome to What Makes This Fighter Great, a series where we use the Fighter Index to break down some of the most successful fighters in MMA history. And for our first episode, we're looking at one of the greatest featherweights the sport has ever seen, Max Holloway. We'll start by taking a look at the fighter and the career that made him a future Hall of Famer. Max Holloway is one of the most accomplished fighters in UFC history. A former UFC Featherweight Champion, a former UFC BMF Champion, multiple title defenses, wins over some of the best fighters in his generation. But here's what makes Holloway interesting. He wasn't the biggest puncher in the division, he wasn't the strongest wrestler, he wasn't the most explosive athlete, yet somehow he became one of the most difficult fighters in MMA history to beat. So what made Max Holloway special? Today we're breaking down Max Holloway through the Fighter Index. We'll look at his archetype, his best weapons, the skills that defined his career, and the system that allowed him to become one of the greatest featherweights the sport has ever seen. Before we break down how Max Holloway fights, let's look at who he is. Holloway made his UFC debut in 2012 at just 20 years old and would go on to become one of the most accomplished featherweights in MMA history. He's a former UFC Featherweight Champion, defended his title multiple times, and owns victories over elite fighters including Jose Aldo, Brian Ortega, Anthony Pettis, Cub Swanson, and Justin Gaethje. Throughout his career, Holloway established himself as one of the premier boxers in mixed martial arts and became known for his incredible pace, durability, and ability to overwhelm opponents over the course of a fight. By the time his career is over, Max Holloway will almost certainly be remembered as one of the greatest featherweights the sport has ever seen. Before we break down Max Holloway's archetype and operating system, let's start with his greatest strengths. The first is his pace. Very few fighters in MMA history have been able to maintain the level of activity Holloway brings into a fight. From the opening bell until the final horn, opponents are forced to deal with constant pressure, constant combinations, and constant decision making. That pace alone has broken many elite fighters over the years. Another major strength is his boxing. Holloway possesses one of the cleanest and most effective boxing the sport has ever seen. His ability to combine strikes, attack in volume, and make reads throughout the fight allows him to overwhelm opponents without relying on knockout power. His durability is equally important. Throughout most of his career, Holloway demonstrated an exceptional ability to absorb damage while continuing to execute his game plan. That durability allowed him to pressure opponents into situations where many fighters would become hesitant. Finally, there's his cardio and fight IQ. Holloway doesn't just fight hard for 25 minutes, he fights intelligently for 25 minutes. His ability to maintain a high pace while making good decisions is one of the biggest reasons he remained a championship level fighter for so many years. When you combine elite pace, elite boxing, elite cardio, and elite decision making, you get one of the most effective pressure-based striking systems the sport has ever seen. Despite all of his success, Max Holloway wasn't without weaknesses. The most obvious is that he's never been a dominant offensive grappler. While Holloway's wrestling and jiu-jitsu were both solid, they primarily serve as supporting skills rather than areas where he consistently dictates fights. Against elite grapplers, he has generally preferred to keep the fight standing rather than engage in extended wrestling exchanges. His defensive striking can also be vulnerable at times. Because Holloway fights at such a high pace and willingly spends long periods in the pocket, he often absorbs more strikes than many other elite fighters. His success has traditionally come from winning exchanges through volume and durability rather than avoiding damage altogether. Another challenge is that his system becomes less effective when opponents successfully disrupt his pace. Elite wrestlers, exceptional range managers, and fighters capable of matching his output can prevent Holloway from building the momentum that normally drives his success. What's important to understand, however, is that none of these weaknesses are severe enough to define his career. Holloway's strengths consistently outweighed his vulnerabilities, which is why he remained one of the most successful fighters of his era. Within the Fighter Index, Max Holloway falls into an S-tier volume boxer archetype. Volume boxers don't win fights by landing the biggest shot, they win by landing the most shots. Their goal is to overwhelm opponents with activity, pace, and layered combinations. Every exchange is an opportunity to score, every round is an opportunity to build momentum, and every minute that passes puts more pressure on their opponent to keep up. That's exactly what made Holloway so effective throughout his career. While other fighters are searching for one perfect opening, Holloway is constantly creating new ones through volume. He's not trying to win a handful of exchanges, he's trying to win hundreds of them over the course of a fight. The longer the fight lasts, the more dangerous a volume boxer becomes. Opponents begin slowing down, their reactions become less sharp, their defenses become less disciplined, and that's when the archetype starts operating at its highest level. Every great fighter has an operating system. It's the underlying strategy that connects all of their skills together and dictates the type of fight they're trying to create. For Max Holloway, the goal is simple: force opponents to fight at a pace they can't sustain. Everything Holloway does serves that objective. He's constantly throwing combinations, constantly touching his opponent, and constantly forcing reactions. Not every strike is meant to hurt, not every combination is meant to finish. Many of them exist simply to keep the opponent working. Every defensive movement requires energy, every exchange requires focus. Every minute spent fighting Holloway requires effort, and over time those small costs begin to add up. As opponents start slowing down, Holloway starts accelerating. His combinations become longer, his pressure becomes heavier, and the opportunities to land clean become more frequent. What's interesting about Holloway's operating system is that he doesn't rely on a single weapon. He doesn't need one perfect punch or one perfectly timed takedown. Instead, it creates advantages through accumulation. One successful exchange becomes 10, 10 becomes 50, and 50 becomes a fight that's slowly slipping away from his opponent. The deeper the fight goes, the closer Holloway gets to the type of fight he wants. A fight fought at his pace, on his terms, where his volume, cardio, and durability become increasingly more difficult to overcome. Every operating system is powered by a set of weapons. For Max Holloway, 4 weapons stand above the rest. The first is his pace. Pace is the foundation of everything Holloway does. From the opening bell, he's forcing opponents to work. They're defending combinations, reacting to feints, adjusting their positioning, and constantly making decisions. Holloway's goal isn't just to fight, it's to make his opponent fight harder than they want to. The second weapon is combination boxing. Very few fighters in MMA history have been able to put punches together like Max Holloway. He rarely attacks with a single strike. Instead, he layers his offense together in long combinations that force opponents to defend multiple threats at once. Even when the first punch misses, the second, third, or fourth strike often find his target. The third weapon is cardio. A volume boxer can only be as effective as their gas tank allows. Holloway's ability to maintain a relentless pace for 15 or 25 minutes is what separates him from most fighters. While opponents begin to slow down, Holloway is often operating at the same pace or an even higher one late in the fight. The final weapon is durability. To pressure opponents and fight at the pace Holloway prefers, a fighter has to be willing to enter exchanges repeatedly. Holloway's durability gave him the confidence to stay active, absorb damage when necessary, and continue applying pressure without abandoning his game plan. Individually, each of these weapons is valuable. Together, they create one of the most effective pressure-based striking systems the featherweight division has ever seen. Now let's take a look at Max Holloway through the skill matrix. The skill matrix is the foundation of the fighter index. It's how we quantify our fighters' abilities across 16 different skills organized into 4 pillars. Rather than relying on vague descriptions or general impressions, the skill matrix gives us a structured way to measure where a fighter excels, where they're merely good, and where potential weaknesses exist. For Max Holloway, the scores reveal exactly why he was able to become one of the greatest featherweights in MMA history. Starting with Pillar 1, Fight IQ and Athletic Tools. Holloway scores a 9 in Fight IQ, an 8 in Athleticism, a 10 in Stamina, and a 9 in Resolve. The score that immediately stands out is the 10 in Stamina. Everything about Holloway's game is built around pace, pressure, and volume. Most fighters slow down as fights progress. Holloway gets stronger. Combined with a 9 in Fight IQ and a 9 in Resolve, you get a fighter who not only knows how to win fights, but also has the discipline and endurance to stick to his game plan for 25 minutes. Moving to Pillar 2, Striking and Stand-Up Defense. Holloway scores a 9 in striking, a 7 in the clinch, a 7 in striking defense, and a 9 in chin. This is where the identity of Holloway's game really comes into focus. His 9 in striking reflects his elite boxing skills, while his 9 in chin give him the confidence to stay active in exchanges that would force many other opponents to become more cautious. Interestingly, his defensive scores aren't elite. Holloway's success has never been about avoiding every strike. It's about winning the overall battle through volume, pressure, and durability. In Pillar 3, Grappling and Control, Holloway scores a 7 in wrestling, a 6 in takedown offense, a 7 in top control, and a 7 in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. These scores reveal an important part of Holloway's game. He's not a dominant grappler, but he's far from a one-dimensional striker. His wrestling and grappling are good enough to keep opponents honest and prevent them from exploiting obvious weaknesses. And finally, in Pillar 4, Defense, Scrambles, and Ground Survival, Holloway scores an 8 in takedown defense, 8 in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu defense, 7 in off the back, and 8 in scrambles. This pillar explains why so many wrestlers have struggled to consistently control him. Holloway's defensive grappling isn't built around offensive dominance, it's built around survival, recovery, and getting back to the type of fights he wants. Even when opponents succeed in changing levels, they're rarely able to keep him there for long. Taken together, Holloway's skill matrix paints a clear picture. This isn't a specialist built around one overwhelming skill, it's a remarkably complete fighter anchored by elite cardio, elite boxing, elite durability, and the intelligence to tie everything together. Now that we've quantified Holloway's skills through the skill matrix, we can examine his tactical dynamics. Tactical dynamics is a study of how a fighter's skills interact with one another, because great fighters aren't simply collections of individual skills. Their abilities work together to create advantages that are greater than the sum of their parts. For Max Holloway, everything begins with his 10 in stamina. That elite gas tank allows him to maintain a pace that most fighters simply can't match. But stamina alone doesn't win fights. Holloway also possesses a 9 in striking, giving him the technical ability to capitalize on the opportunities his pace creates. As opponents become tired, their reactions slow, their defenses become less disciplined, their movement becomes less efficient. That's where Holloway's volume starts becoming increasingly effective. His 9 and fight IQ plays an equally important role. Holloway understands when to push the pace, when to pressure, and when to simply continue accumulating damage. Rather than chasing finishes recklessly, he forces opponents into a battle of attrition that favors his strengths. His 9 in resolve and 9 in chin further reinforce the system. Holloway is willing to stay active in difficult exchanges because he trusts both his durability and his ability to recover from adversity. Many fighters become hesitant after absorbing clean shots. Holloway often continues operating at the same pace. Even as grappling scores contribute to the overall picture, his 8 in takedown defense, 8 in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu defense, and 8 in scrambles aren't there to make him a dominant grappler. They're there to keep the fight in areas where his greatest advantages exist. When you put it all together, you begin to see the full machine. His defensive grappling keeps him standing, his durability allows him to pressure, his stamina allows him to maintain that pressure, his striking allows him to convert pressure into offense, and his fight IQ ties everything together. That's what makes Max Holloway so difficult to beat. Not one dominant skill, but a collection of elite and complementary skills working together towards a single objective, forcing opponents to fight at a pace they can't sustain. Every archetype has matchups that it naturally gravitates toward, and also matchups that can create problems. But that doesn't mean the outcome is predetermined. Great fighters can overcome difficult stylistic challenges, but understanding these dynamics helps explain why certain fights look the way they do. For volume boxers like Max Holloway, the ideal matchup is often an opponent who allows them to establish their pace. The archetype tends to perform well against low-volume strikers because Holloway can gradually build a lead through activity and output. Even when individual exchanges are competitive, the sheer number of exchanges often favors the volume boxer over time. Volume boxers also tend to excel against fighters with questionable cardio, because their entire operating system is built around forcing opponents to work. Every minute that passes increases the pressure on fighters who struggle to maintain a high pace. Another favorable matchup is against reactive fighters who prefer to wait for opportunities rather than create them. Holloway's constant activity forces those fighters into a defensive cycle where they're reacting to his offense rather than implementing their own game plan. On the other hand, some archetypes present unique challenges. Elite wrestlers can disrupt the volume boxer's rhythm before it ever gets established. Every successful takedown slows the pace, limits offensive opportunities, and forces Holloway to spend energy getting back on his feet instead of building volume. Exceptional range managers also create problems. Fighters who control distance effectively can reduce the number of exchanges Holloway needs to accumulate damage and score points. Finally, fighters capable of matching Holloway's pace remove one of his biggest advantages. If both athletes are comfortable fighting at high output for extended periods, the battle becomes less about endurance and more about who possesses the superior technical skills. What's interesting is that Holloway's skill matrix helped him overcome many of the challenges that volume boxers typically face. His strong defensive grappling makes him difficult to control, while his fight IQ allows him to make adjustments against a wide variety of opponents. That's why Max Holloway isn't simply a successful volume boxer, he's one of the most complete and effective examples of the archetype. Fighter's archetype, operating system, and skill matrix are all theoretical until we see them applied against elite competition. For Max Holloway, several performances perfectly illustrate why he became one of the greatest featherweights in MMA history. The first is his victory over Brian Ortega. This fight showcased the complete volume boxer experience. Holloway continuously forced exchanges, maintained a relentless pace, and steadily increased his output as the fight progressed. As Ortega absorbed more damage and became increasingly reactive, Holloway's striking advantage grew larger and larger. It was a perfect example of his operating system taking control of a fight over time. The second performance is his dominant victory over Calvin Kattar. If the Ortega fight demonstrated how Holloway's system works, the Kattar fight demonstrated its absolute ceiling. Across 5 rounds, Holloway produced one of the greatest striking performances in MMA history. His pace never slowed, the combinations remained sharp, his decision-making remained disciplined, every major strength identified in the skill matrix was on display. The fight became a showcase of elite stamina, elite striking, elite durability, and elite fight IQ all working together at the highest level. Finally, we have Holloway's trilogy with Alexander Volkanovski. While Holloway had moments of success, these fights also highlighted some of the challenges that volume boxers can face against exceptionally complete opponents. Volkanovski's ability to manage range, make adjustments, mix his attacks, and neutralize portions of Holloway's offense prevented Holloway from fully establishing the pace that typically drives his system. These fights served as an important reminder that even elite archetypes can be challenged by fighters capable of disrupting the conditions they rely on most. Taken together, these performances tell the story of Max Holloway's career. The Ortega fight showed how the system works, the Kattar fight showed the system at its peak, and the Volkanovski fight showed the limits of even the most effective volume boxers the sport has ever seen. Like most great fighters, Max Holloway wasn't the finished product when he entered the UFC. The version of Holloway that debuted in 2012 was a talented and aggressive striker, but many of the qualities that would eventually define his career were still developing. Early in his UFC run, Holloway relied heavily on his natural instincts and offensive creativity. The volume was already there, but it wasn't yet refined into the disciplined system that would later make him a champion. He was still learning when to push the pace, how to manage distance, and how to maximize his output over the course of a fight. As Holloway matured, so does his understanding of the volume boxer archetype. The championship version of Holloway became far more efficient. Instead of simply throwing more strikes at his opponents, he learned how to weaponize pace itself. His combinations became cleaner, his decision-making improved, and the ability to maintain pressure for 5 rounds became one of the defining traits of his career. This was the version of Holloway that captured UFC gold and established himself as one of the best featherweights in the world. His skill matrix was no longer built around potential, it was built around proven elite abilities. Later in his career, Holloway evolved once again. The veteran version became a more complete and measured fighter. While the pace and volume remained, his approach became increasingly intelligent and adaptable. Years of championship experience sharpened his fight IQ and allowed him to make adjustments against a wider variety of opponents. What makes Holloway's evolution so impressive is that he never abandoned the foundation of his game. The archetype remained the same, the operating system remained the same, the goal remained the same. Each version of Holloway simply became better at executing it. That's one of the hallmarks of a truly great fighter, not constantly reinventing themselves, but continuously refining the system that made them successful in the first place. So what does the Fighter Index ultimately tell us about Max Holloway? It tells us that Holloway wasn't defined by a single overwhelming advantage. He wasn't the hardest hitter in the division, he wasn't the most explosive athlete, he wasn't the most dominant wrestler. Instead, Holloway built his career around a collection of elite skills that worked together to create one of the most effective systems in MMA history. His 10 in stamina allowed him to maintain a pace few fighters could match. His 9 in striking gave him the technical ability to capitalize on that pace. His 9 in fight IQ helped him make the right decisions over the course of the fight. And his 9 in resolve and 9 in chin allowed him to continue executing his game plan even when facing adversity. The result was a fighter who could overwhelm opponents not through one moment, but through hundreds of moments. One exchange, one combination, one round at a time. Within the Fighter Index, Max Holloway stands as one of the greatest examples of the volume boxer archetype the sport has ever seen. A fighter whose success was built not on a single weapon, but on a system powered by pace, pressure, volume, and relentless consistency. And that's the Fighter Index breakdown of Max Holloway. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode of What Makes This Fighter Great, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know what fighter you'd like to see next. Also, be sure to watch the weekly Fighter Index breakdown videos. Catch you on the next one.